Good afternoon, everyone. It's exciting to be here. I wanted to, well, as Joao mentioned, I started with USDA back in March. And so today I wanted to spend my brief amount of time just getting you up to speed on some of our major research projects. So one of our highest priority projects at the moment is looking at the use of embryo transfer and its effect on fertility evaluations. And the motivation for this project was the exponential increase in calves reportedly born by ET in the last few years. Now, disappointingly, ET breeding event reporting has not followed the same trend. And so these data come to us through Format 5 codes, which have not been available as long as commercial ET use, which really took off in 1979. But these codes have been adopted by the industry since 2002, and yet as of 2020, they still accounted for less than 1% of the breeding types and are ultimately just a fraction of what we would expect given this higher prevalence of ET calves being born. So this observed discrepancy led us to wonder if ET is being incorrectly coded as AI. So we used a subset of data from the last 5 years and matched reported mating types with recorded birthing types under the assumption that ET calving is more likely to be recorded correctly than a breeding event. And so we can interpret the first line of this table here to say that about 35,000 AI breedings are corresponding to calves who were later reported born by ET. And so this means about 0.3% of AI matings are likely incorrectly reported. So we extrapolated this to other breeding events to see the error rates, and we see the error rates here are consistently low. So this would appear to be good news, but if you note the green percentages in the lower right corner, you'll see that ET is also being reported correctly at a very low rate. So while this is a start to understanding the problem, it's not a foolproof method. So for example, this approach does not distinguish between instances when the genetic and maternal dams are the same, but the calf is coded ET, and that conflict would seem to indicate the calf's not really ET, it's AI, or it could indicate a situation where the calf is ET, but the owner forgot and has reported the maternal dam instead of the genetic dam, in which case it is a pedigree error. And so with this historical data, we don't really have a way of teasing out those differences. Now, herds that use a lot of ET are often large and important to the US dairy cattle population, so we don't necessarily want to remove them entirely, and nor should herds responsibly coding ET use be penalized. So one possible solution to clean up this historical data is to censor herds with large discrepancies in the number of ET calves born compared to the amount of INJ they report. But disappointingly, only 208 herds are reporting both ET and INJ. And so for context, 964 herds report ET calves born, and over 1,000 report using ET breeding events, INJ events. But again, only 208 are reporting both. And even among herds who do report both, there's little consistency. So here we show a ratio of ET calves to INJ events. And while overall we're getting many more records of ET calves being born, that was the line graph I showed earlier, the majority of farms who are consistently sending us ET data tend to report more INJ events than they do calves born. And this could be for any number of reasons, including ET not taking and her next calf being born by a cleanup round of AI or natural service, but maybe that final breeding event was not made into the herd management software. And we don't really have any way of knowing what the actual explanation is. So we've spent considerable time looking at this historical data and found many anomalies like what I just mentioned. Some other examples are about 26% of herd years which reported INJ events reported no calves born at all, ET or otherwise. And also interesting, almost 2% of these herd years reported ET calves evidently born by immaculate conception because there was no record of any kind of breeding events occurring at this farm at all. So ultimately, to control for all of these different scenarios, we've imposed a two-step edit. So first, to identify herd years reporting a substantial amount of ET, which we've defined as greater than 10% calves purportedly born by ET. And secondly, for those herd years, removing records if they report less than half of the INJ events expected, given the number of ET calves born. So this allows us to preserve as much data as possible while removing the data most likely to confound our estimates of fertility. And so we've begun testing this with sire conception rate, and we're evaluating its impact by looking at the difference in SCR estimates with and without ET censoring. And we actually just finished these initial calculations on Monday, so you're seeing the freshest analysis that we have. So if we look at this difference in SCR by breed, we see that nearly all median differences are 0, showing that this edit is actually having very little effect on evaluations for SCR. And we would expect a really high correlation in this differences in SCR scores and percent ET usage, given that the records were censored on the basis of ET usage. So if we plot percent ET use by the differences in SCR for each breed, it seems like the service sires with the largest ET percent tend to have an SCR difference of nearly 0. And this is most likely a function of total number of matings, with popular proven bulls being prioritized for ET over young bulls, and their larger number of records making the small proportion of ET errors almost negligible. So this theory is supported by regressing this difference in SCR on total matings. And probably the easiest to interpret example would be Holstein, just because there's so much more data. So if we zoom in and look more closely at it, we can see that as more mating records are added, the difference in SCR here is converging on 0. So this might explain anecdotal reports of young bulls whose estimates can change a lot as more records are added. The good news is, consistent with statistical theory, the more records we add, the closer we get to the true value, and the true value of ET influence on SCR for proven bulls appears to be nearly 0. But I also want to note here that even for non-zeros, we're still talking about a difference of plus or minus 1 percentage point, which is ultimately going to have very little effect. So I want to close on this topic by revisiting this slide here. Given our earlier discovery that some farms are reporting INJ but not ET, it's likely that ET prevalence is even higher than we realize. And so we really need strategies to improve this data flow before it gets on top of us. Right now, ET is having very little effect, but that's not a guarantee if ET calves keep increasing at this exponential rate without a parallel increase in INJ reporting. So it's not obvious in this plot, but if we zoom in on INJ reporting only, we can see that they actually peaked in 2016 and then experienced a fairly steady decline since then, which is a little discouraging and sort of reemphasizes the need to improve this reporting. And so the key to improving this data flow is to identify what our major roadblocks are. So a few years ago, the Pursuing Data Quality team, which advises CDCB, identified the primary obstacle to be on-farm reporting. And so a few years ago, they disseminated resources on correct ET entry into the most common herd management softwares, including some of the ones we've already mentioned, DairyComp, BoviSync, PCDart. And it seems likely that herd owners and managers who are investing so much in running an ET program would have decent management of it. And so the problem is likely that these data aren't reaching us. It's not leaving the farm. So in the meantime, AGIL will continue looking at the effects of ET on SCR, because as I mentioned, this research is ongoing, as well as heifer conception rate and cow conception rate. And we aim to be able to implement these edits in national genomic evaluations by next April. So some other ongoing projects, other members of our group have recently turned their attention to the benefits of flexible testing options. So some farms have their own methods for getting milk weights and maybe even approximate somatic cell count, so they don't participate in DHI monthly testing and don't have fat and protein records. And so the current data filtering edits assume fat yield is always recorded and excludes milk only records, because we don't know that self-measuring farms are meeting quality certifications for meters. So when some milk only records do reach us, they're stored but not extracted. And so we don't really need more milk records, but including those herds, they're often big and important to the dairy population, will allow us to use the records they have for all other traits, especially low heritability ones, which would really benefit from increased number of records to improve their accuracy. So these edits, which only include data from milk-only herds with certified milk meters, have resulted in nearly 1 million additional records. So that's going through testing before implementation. Now, at the April interval meeting, Dr. Togiani of AGIL compared foreign bull use across multiple countries and ultimately found that more countries should be using more foreign sires. So for example, if you look at Japan, only 2 to 4% of their bulls are topping these sire lists, yet only 39% of their milk reported cows are reporting foreign sires. And then I see Joao's gentle reminder here that we're starting to need to wrap up. So my final slide I want to share is just to tell you that we're in the middle of our 5-year planning, which we then submit at the end of November. So this is sort of how USDA decides what our research priorities will be moving forward. So we've compiled priorities indicated in our various stakeholder listening sessions earlier this year, which we plan to include. And I also want to mention we're adding a new scientist to the team. This position closed last week, and we expect to start interviewing candidates soon. And because there is not time for questions, I would invite anybody to please feel free to direct them to my email. Thank you.